A Journey to the Center of the Earth. Chapter 9. The Central Sea. When I regained consciousness, I found myself lying on some thick sleeping rugs. I groaned and opened my eyes to find my uncle gazing at me with tears in his eyes. "He lives! He lives!" cried my uncle. "Yes, my good uncle," I whispered. At that point, Hans joined us. "Good day," he said. "Where are we, Uncle?" I asked. "What day is this? What happened?" "It's 11 o'clock at night on Sunday, August 9th, my uncle answered. "Your head is bandaged, and you need to sleep. I will tell you everything tomorrow." As my eyes closed, I realized that my dangerous adventure in the interior of the earth, in total darkness, had lasted 4 days. When I awoke the next day, I began to look around me. The cave floor was a soft, silvery sand, and the ceiling was adorned with magnificent stalactites glittering in all the colors of the rainbow. Though no torch lit the cave, light seemed to be coming from somewhere. I even imagined that I could hear the sighing of the wind and the breaking of waves on a beach. Of course, all that was impossible, for we were 100 miles below the surface. Was I dreaming? Or had some great crack in the earth brought the wind and the sea to me? Or had my uncle given up his expedition and carried me back to the surface? I was puzzling over these questions when my uncle joined me. "Good morning, Harry," he said. "You are looking better. Hans has treated your wounds with his own special ointment, and they are healing marvelously. Now, would you like to eat?" For the first time in days, I was hungry. And as I ate, my uncle explained that my fall had brought me down an almost vertical tunnel, along with a rock slide, right into his arms. "It is indeed a miracle that you are alive," he said. "We must never separate again." I looked at my uncle in astonishment. The journey then was not over. "But haven't we returned to the surface?" I asked. "Certainly not," he replied. "Then I must be mad, for I see daylight and hear the wind and the waves." My uncle smiled. "You see and hear correctly," he said. "I cannot explain, but you must see for yourself." "Let us go," I cried, eager to satisfy my curiosity. "Just a moment. Do you feel well enough? After all, the wind is quite rough, and you must be strong for your sea voyage." "My sea voyage?" I cried. "You will see. We must be ready to go on board by tomorrow, and it may be a long trip." Go on board what and how? My curiosity had to be satisfied. So I rushed from the cave. At first, I could not see anything because my eyes were not accustomed to the light, and I was forced to close them. When I reopened them, I stood stupefied at the scene. "The sea! The sea!" I cried. "Yes," said my uncle. "The Central Sea, as I have named it." It was quite true. The sea spread before me as far as my eyes could see. Its shores was made of soft golden sand sprinkled with shells. Waves broke on the shore with a murmuring found only in underground places. Back from the beach, huge rocky cliffs rose higher than my eyes could see. Above my head, gases formed thick clouds, partially concealing the granite roof that I knew was miles above my head. Yet from between these clouds shone an unusually beautiful ray of light, not like the sun, for it gave off no heat. We were in some gigantic cavern more wonderful than any I had ever read about, and it left me speechless. My uncle and I strolled along the beach, breathing in the salt air after 47 days in dark tunnels. Beautiful waterfalls leaped down the rocky cliffs and disappeared into the sea. After we had gone about 500 yards, we turned a sharp bend and found ourselves close to a huge forest. The trees, shaped almost like umbrellas, stood tall and motionless despite the strong breeze. I could identify most of the 2,000 known trees in the world, but I had never seen any quite like these before. We went toward the forest. When at last we reached it, I found that I stood not in a forest of trees, but a forest of giant mushrooms. The white mushrooms stood nearly 40 feet high with tops spreading 40 feet across. We walked on and found new wonders with every step. Ferns as big as pine trees, giant grass, and trees as tall as 100 feet in height. Astonishing! Magnificent! Cried my uncle. These specimens, which are only small plants in our garden today, were all mighty trees when the world began. If this is true of plant life, would it not also be true of animal life? I asked, looking around anxiously. Yes, my boy. Just look at the bones up ahead on the beach. Some are as gigantic as trunks of trees. I stooped down eagerly and examined the lower jawbone of a mastodon and the molars of a Dinotherium. You're right, I cried. These mighty animals once lived and died on the shores of this underground sea. It is possible, oh my God, that one of these huge monsters may be hidden behind one of these mighty rocks at this very moment. I looked around, but nothing alive appeared on these deserted shores. Even though I had seen many exciting things, I was tired from my recent ordeal and found it necessary to rest, especially if we were going on a sea voyage soon. So we returned to the cave. The next morning, I awoke completely refreshed. I took a bath in the waters of the sea, had breakfast, and then again walked along the shore with my uncle. Where are we now in surface to the relation? I asked him. We are over 1,000 miles from Sneffels and 110 miles under the surface, he said. Then that would put us, let's see, somewhere below the Scottish Highlands, I answered. You're quite right, he laughed. Are you now planning to return to the surface? I asked. Go back, he cried, before we finish our journey? But we've reached the Great Sea, I said. I judge it to only be about 150 miles across, he replied. And how are we to cross it? I asked with some alarm. Swim? You shall see, he said. And I did. Thanks to Hans' hard work, we had a raft 10 feet long and 5 feet wide. It was made of fossil wood from the pines and firs that Hans had found and tied together with our sturdy climbing ropes. A mast stood upright, and hanging from it was a sail made from one of our sheets. At 6 o'clock on the morning of the 13th of August, we loaded our supplies on the raft and pushed it into the sea. Hans had fashioned a rudder, and he guided us with ease. As the wind was strong, we made good time in the first hours afloat. We passed gigantic clumps of seaweed, 3,000 to 4,000 feet long. They looked like snakes stretching beyond the horizon. After a few hours, Hans baited a hook with a little piece of meat and dropped it into the underground sea. Were there fish in these waters? He waited a long time. Then suddenly, Hans pulled up his line. On the hook was a fish much resembling a lake sturgeon, but of a family that had been extinct for ages. A blind fish that had absolutely no eyes. In this way, we got much needed food for our future travels. The second day at sea found the wind steady and the raft moving as quickly as before. We were becoming bored with the trip and impatient to find the other end of the vast sea. My uncle was scanning the horizon with his telescope, muttering angrily to himself. What's wrong, Uncle? I asked. I thought the sea to be only 150 miles across, but we've already traveled 3 times that distance, and we're not nearing any land. I'm beginning to wonder if Saknussemm found this sea and crossed it. I wonder if we are still on the right path to the center of the earth. We sailed on like that for 2 days more. The only excitement came when trying to find the depth of the sea. Hans tied a crowbar to a rope and dropped it into the water. It came up half crushed with big scratch marks on it. What are those marks? I asked. Hans looked closely. "Teeth," he answered. I decided that I never wanted to see the huge animal with teeth so strong as to crush iron and leave such marks on it. On Tuesday, the 18th of August, we moved as before. Towards evening, I fell asleep, only to be awakened when the raft was lifted high out of the water. "What is it?" I yelled. Hans raised his hand and pointed to a huge black mass moving in and out of the water about 200 yards from the raft. "A colossal monster!" I cried. "Yes," cried my uncle, "and over there is a huge sea lizard, and there, closer to the raft, a giant crocodile with teeth at least a foot high." Then an enormous whale appeared. Then 40-foot-long turtles and other huge monsters, all heading toward us, ready to destroy our raft with the movement of a tail or the bite of a mouth. I picked up my rifle ready to shoot, but Hans stopped me. A bullet would have no effect on the armor scales covering their bodies. Then all but two disappeared into the sea, and those two made a rush at one another. One had the head of a lizard and the teeth of a crocodile and the snout of a porpoise. It was the most fearful of all primitive reptiles, the ichthyosaurus, or giant fish lizard. The other was a monstrous serpent with the hard shell of a turtle. It was the terrible plesiosaurus, or sea crocodile. As we watched the two giants begin a furious battle that lasted for hours, mountains of water dashed over our raft and nearly hurled us headlong into the waves. Hideous hisses from the monster brought terror to our hearts. Suddenly, the two disappeared beneath the waves, almost drawing us into the whirlpool they left behind. Several minutes passed. Then the head of the plesiosaurus rose out of the water, its serpent-like neck twisted in the agony of death. Its body convulsed and then stopped, and the mighty snake lay dead on the now calm waters. As for the ichthyosaurus, had he gone under the sea to rest, or would he reappear to destroy us? Chapter 10. A Storm at Sea. It was now Friday, the 21st of August. We had traveled more than 800 miles on this sea, and I calculated our position to be exactly under England. The sea was calm, and the fresh wind was moving us along. Yet something was different. The clouds, if that is what they could be called, were breaking up into what looked like huge balls of cotton, and were falling toward the sea, becoming darker as they fell. "I think we're in for some sort of storm," I told my uncle. He pointed up at the sky, but said nothing. It soon became obvious that there was much electricity in the air. My hair started to stand on end, and I think that if one of my companions had touched me, he would have received a terrible shock. At 10 o'clock, the signs of a storm became even clearer. The clouds were black, and the wind seemed to die down as if getting ready for a battle. The raft sat motionless on the dark sea. "We should lower the sail," I said. "No, no," my uncle said angrily. "Let the wind strike us and sweep us away. Perhaps it will finally carry us to the other side of the endless sea." Suddenly the storm hit. It came from all corners of the cavern at once, howling, shrieking, and raising. The darkness increased. The raft rose and fell with the storm, bounding over the waves. My uncle was thrown headlong onto the deck, where he lay quietly. His eyes were open, and he seemed to be enjoying the storm as he held on for his life. I went to him, crawling, so that I would not be tossed overboard into the raging sea. As for Hans, he never moved a muscle. His long hair was blowing wildly in the storm, but he just sat in place. We were moving at an unbelievable speed before the wind, heading for a certain rain. "Lower the sail," I yelled, using my hand to make a megaphone so I could be heard above the roaring of the storm. "No," my uncle yelled back. "Let it alone." The sea began to foam wildly. Fearful claps of thunder were accompanied by the brightest lightning I had ever seen. The flashes crossed one another, hurling from every side. Hailstorms that shone like lamps struck the raft, threatening to overturn us. My eyes were blinded by the bright flashes in the dark sky. My ears were deafened by the roar of the thunderclaps, which were so loud that it seemed as if all the gunpowder in the world had exploded at the same instant. The storm did not lessen for even an instant, all day and all night, and Sunday the 23rd found us still under attack by the elements. It was Monday the 24th, and the storm continued as if it had just begun. My uncle and I were broken and tired, but Hans seemed as fresh and alert as that day we had begun our journey almost 2 months before. About 12 o'clock, the storm became worse, and we were forced to tie down all of our cargo to the deck of the raft, or else it would have been washed overboard. At times, the entire raft was underwater, and my uncle and I had to tie ourselves to the mast. I took out my notebook and wrote for my uncle to see. "Take in sail." He shook his head, yes. But it was too late. A ball of fire swept over the raft and carried the mast and sail into the sky like a kite. We were frozen, actually shivering with terror. The ball of fire, half white, half red, moved along, first heading away from our raft, then toward it, until finally it landed on the powder barrel. We knew that an explosion would come soon, but it did not. The fireball moved again, approaching Hans. Then my uncle, then me. Gases came from it and choked us. Suddenly, the ball of fire burst, producing such great electricity that it blinded us all for the moment. Then it went out, and darkness once more fell upon the water. We continued to move rapidly, even though we no longer had a sail. I made some quick calculations. We must have gone under England, the Channel, France, and most of Europe by this time. Suddenly, there was another great noise, the noise of the sea breaking on a rocky shore. The waves tossed our small craft onto the shore with such force that the raft was wrecked. I would have died had it not been for Hans, who carried my broken and bruised body out of the boiling surf and over the slippery rocks that marked the shore. Our ocean voyage had ended, and I was glad to see the end of the Central Sea. Hans took my uncle and me and the goods he had managed to save from the wrecked raft to a shelter under a rocky overhang. He prepared some food, but after the last 3 days, all I wanted to do was sleep. The next day when I awoke, the weather was again beautiful. Every trace of the storm had disappeared. "Well, my boy," said my uncle cheerfully, "have you slept soundly?" "Yes," I replied. "And have we now reached the end of our journey?" My uncle seemed surprised. "Of course not," he said. "We can now continue on our journey by land to the center of the earth." "And how will we get back?" I asked. "Simple," he said with a smile. "When we reach the exact center of the earth, we will simply find a new way back up to the surface, or we will follow the way we came." "And what do we do for provisions?" "Hans has taken care of that," he said. "He has saved much from the raft, and he will see to it that we find whatever we need along the way. Have you any doubts that he can do what I say?" I had to admit that Hans could do whatever he set out to do. We went to the rocky overhang where Hans had laid out the supplies and provisions he had rescued. We had a 4-month supply of biscuits, dried fish, and salted meat, plenty of water, and most of our instruments. Only our guns were lost. "And the raft?" I asked. "I don't think we'll need it again," said my uncle, "and I have an idea that we shall not come out through the same opening by which we entered." Was my uncle mad? Little did I know how true his words would prove to be. "Where do you think we are now in relation to the upper world?" I asked my uncle. "It's hard to tell exactly, but I calculate that we traveled about 900 miles upon the sea," he said. "We are about 2,700 miles from Sneffels. That would put us exactly under the Mediterranean Sea." My uncle took out his compass, as if to prove what he said. He looked at the needle, and his face went white. "What's the matter?" I asked. He could not speak. He closed his eyes, rubbed them, then looked at the needle again. I took the compass from him and examined it. The needle pointed due north in the direction we thought was south. There was only one conclusion to be drawn. During the storm, the wind had reversed itself, and the shore on which we now stood was the same one we had left so many days before. And we'll call it a day there. Hope you like and subscribe. And as Tigger says, ta-ta for now. Love you guys. Bye-bye.